life before death, strength before weakness, journey before destination. Ahoy, ladies and gentlemen, it is I, the Advocate, and today I'm an advocate for Oathbringer, a book review. Written by Brandon Sanderson and released on November 14, 2017, Oathbringer is the third volume in a planned 10-book epic known as the Stormlight Archive. Is Oathbringer a worthy entry in Brandon Sanderson's magnum opus? Well, before we answer that question, you guys know the drill by now. Like, comment, subscribe, do all the things. It really does help me out. I'm a small channel. I would really appreciate it. And if you haven't done so already, feel free to check out my other videos on my channel where I delve into each of the previous Stormlight books. Not just for my sake, but also because we will be delving into spoilers for The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance in the first part of this video. So definitely read those prior to watching this. As far as spoilers for Edgedancer, Oathbringer, and even other Cosmere novels are concerned though, don't worry, I'll warn you guys when we bump into any potential spoilers for each of those respective books, so definitely check out those timestamps below to let you know when I'm about to spoil stuff. With all that said, let's get to it. So at the risk of potentially having everyone immediately click off at the beginning of this video, I'm just going to go ahead and spill my final thoughts with regards to this book. All in all, I very much enjoyed my time with Oathbringer, and I thought it was another worthwhile entry in the Stormlight Archive. Brandon Sanderson has once again masterfully created an epic story that not only successfully follows up the events of Words of Radiance, but also manages to add even more interesting elements to the universe's already established and very interesting lore and world. On top of that, the world building, scope, action, magic, and even characters continue to be wonderfully written, and I am here for it. With that said, I am also exhausted from it. Now, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, as I've mentioned this ad nauseum in my previous book review videos, but the Stormlight books are some of the cinderiest blocks of cinder block-sized books I've ever read in my life. In fact, from cover to cover, this Oathbringer book is the singularly largest book I've ever read in my entire life. No, I've not read Les Miserables or War and Peace. That is crazy. Now, long doesn't necessarily mean bad, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that not all of this book's 450,000 plus words are exactly full of intrigue. Oathbringer has a bit of a pacing problem, more so than the previous books. There were quite a few times throughout this book where I had to power through a sluggish section in order to get to the next, admittedly amazing, set piece in the story, and the whole experience left me rather fatigued. I was consistently doing this stop-and-go reading thing with Oathbringer as I regularly had to step away from the book and recharge my batteries in order to come back to this book at a later, more revitalized time. So much so that in the end it took me 2 whole months to get through this book. Now, part of that extended duration did come down to my full-time job, my personal life responsibilities, and this book's length, but part of that time also came down to my struggles in navigating through this book's very bloated narrative valleys. Honestly, I can't help but look back at Sanderson's earlier work in The Way of Kings and compare how significantly better paced that book is when in relation to this one. That book's narrower character scope, in addition to a linear story which gradually builds to a fantastic climax, is some of the most engaging fantasy I've ever read. This book is different, though. Now again, I want to reiterate, I did overall enjoy my time with Oathbringer, and this is all subjective. But if I were to graph my own personal journey with this book, I would say that my enjoyment is best reflected by a scatterplot rather than a general line graph. There is certainly intrigue here, and this book's fantastic set pieces definitely help lift this story to being a more enjoyable experience. However, a combination of Oathbringer's less focused scope, encompassing a larger cast of characters, some geographically removed series of events which are not always tied to the main story, and occasionally slow, almost unnecessary predicaments which our main characters find themselves in, definitely create quite a few narrative pitfalls that don't exactly do this story many favors. Oathbringer's storytelling destinations are cool, but the occasional plotting elements which connect us to those destinations make the journey quite exhausting. Nevertheless, when it comes to storytelling destinations, Sanderson definitely knows what he's doing because he continues to surprise me in the best way possible. As is the case with pretty much every Cosmere novel, the good old Sanderson hallmark of the Sanderlanche returns once more. Sanderson is an expert at tying long-running threads that span an entire book over multiple POVs and coalescing them into a gargantuan, fantastic avalanche of a climax. Hence a Sanderlanche. With no exaggeration whatsoever, this book's climax may in fact be the single greatest climax I've ever read in fantasy. I'll provide more insight into this in the spoilers section, but let's just say that Sanderson maintains his mastery of marrying overarching plot lines, some of which have been extending over the course of 3 books, with some cathartic action narration. Now, as far as Oathbringer's characters go, if you've read the first 2 Stormlight novels, then you've probably already guessed that this book focuses on our next main POV on the list, Mr. Dalinar Kholin himself. Dalinar takes center stage here as we periodically take a look at his past and learn how the once feared Blackthorn came to grow into the respected, albeit equally feared, army general and widower he is today. Although I personally still find Kaladin's journey in the Way of Kings to be the more effective character arc, Sanderson still finds a way to make Dalinar very interesting and layered nonetheless. There's a reason for why Dalinar has acquired his notorious reputation, and seeing the contrast of his ugly past, which fully embodies his infamous Blackthorn name, to the present-day Dalinar who just wants to do right by Alethkar, is very interesting. Dalinar trying to run away from his past deeds brings out an emotional response from his persona that I can definitely tell Sanderson had a lot of fun in writing his character. "What would you have me do?" Dalinar shouted. "Would you have me watch the world crumble?" She cocked her head at his outburst. "Maybe you're right, and I am a tyrant. Maybe letting my armies into your city is a terrible risk. But maybe you don't have good options. Maybe all the good men are dead, so all you have is me. Spitting into the storm isn't going to change that fen. You can risk possibly being conquered by the Alethi, or you can definitely fall to the Voidbringer assault alone." Now, although I do love Dalinar getting some of that feel-good main character energy, Oathbringer does consequently sideline some of our other main POVs. Predominantly my main man Kaladin. Now, there's nothing wrong with Kaladin stepping away from the limelight for a bit here, as he's already been the main feature of a previous book. However, I was somewhat caught off guard by how underutilized he was in this book. Without delving too deeply into spoilers, it seemed like Kaladin was primed to play a larger role within this story based on some personal and emotional moments he experiences in Part 1. However, that all goes by the wayside pretty quickly as he soon becomes embroiled in some B-plots and doesn't really feature again until the book's climax. Kaladin does still shine here and there throughout this story, but I don't know. I would have personally liked to have seen a more impactful journey from him, especially given how well written his character arc was in the previous books. It's akin to eating a bowl of Lucky Charms and realizing that you've already finished most of the marshmallows in your earlier bites. The cereal is still good, and there's definitely even a few remaining marshmallow pieces you didn't even know were still in the bowl, but you just can't forget those first few delicious spoonfuls of exclusively marshmallow charms. So we've already established I love Kaladin's character, and I think Dalinar is pretty great too. Shallan and Adolin, on the other hand, they're good. They're decent. You know what? We'll come back to them in the spoilers section. I've got some things to say about them. Other characters we've grown familiar with, such as Navani, the Bridge 4 crew, and our very interesting Parshendi friends, make their POV returns as well, and they definitely help keep the book afloat, even during some of the book's slower middle chapters. Not as adequately afloat as the book would be if we got some more Kaladin love, but again, that's just a personal preference and something I need to get over. Now, moving away from our main characters, one of the biggest question marks going into this book was how well the events from outside the Stormlight series proper would tie into Oathbringer. Most specifically, events pertaining to our sneaky little Stormlight book 2.5, Edgedancer. For those of you unaware, Edgedancer is a 260-page novella also written by Brandon Sanderson, which takes place between the events of Words of Radiance and Oathbringer. Now, Sanderson writes Oathbringer with the belief that you as the reader are aware of the big plot revelations that take place in Edgedancer. However, personally speaking, those revelations aren't super earth-shattering, and I think a reader could very easily skip Edgedancer and not be lost with regards to the events that take place in Oathbringer. On top of that, what you may have missed in Edgedancer by skipping the book is not all too difficult to piece together based on context from this book. All this to say, if you're wondering whether to read or skip Edgedancer prior to reading Oathbringer, my recommendation would be to just skip the novella entirely and look up what happens online. Sorry guys, I'm not that big of a fan of Lift. Please forgive me. However, if you are a completionist and want to be as Stormlight literate as possible, then you can definitely go ahead and check out Edgedancer. Just be warned that Lift's perspective in that book is rather divisive and may not be your cup of tea. As far as other series outside of the Stormlight Archive go, such as Mistborn, Elantris, and Warbreaker, then you should know by now that my recommendation is to have already read those books prior to have even started the Stormlight Archive. But let's say you're already one book in too deep into the Stormlight Archive and the last thing you want is to pull away from this series in order to read something else that feels unrelated. Then don't worry. Although there are plenty of Easter eggs which connect this world to the overall Cosmere universe, those other Cosmere novels aren't an absolute must-read in order to totally understand Stormlight's story. But man, do they make the journey that much more rewarding. I won't delve into spoilers here, but as I continue to dig deeper into this series, I've come to appreciate how hard of a worker Sanderson is in having created this very rich, very lore-heavy shared universe. Each book in the Stormlight Archive delves further into connections with some of the other Cosmere novels, that I feel a new reader wouldn't really appreciate the gravity of some of these connections unless they read those other books. Now, I'm not trying to gatekeep, and anyone can read these books in whatever order they wish, but I did find myself consistently thinking throughout this book, wow, this Easter egg is so cool, I'm sure glad I read Warbreaker. It's up to you. But if for some reason you read The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance but haven't read any of the other Cosmere novels, I strongly recommend you at least pause for one book and read Warbreaker prior to continuing this series. It's worth it. But alright, if you couldn't already tell, there's quite a bit of spoilery story stuff I'm straining to talk about. So if you haven't read Oathbringer, click on those timestamps below to skip ahead to the conclusion of this video and I'll see you soon because we're about to delve into spoilers. So ultimately, enjoyment of any piece of entertainment media is largely subjective. Just because I struggle to get through certain sections of a book doesn't mean everyone is entitled to feel the same way. However, I do think there is merit in an argument that this book's pacing isn't ideal, and it could have used an extra edit in order to really tighten up the story. Despite Oathbringer's 5-part structure, which has been the standard for every Stormlight novel thus far, it's clear to me that Sanderson wrote Oathbringer with a 3-act structure in mind. We have an eventful part 1 which sees Kaladin meeting up with his parents, Shallan investigating Sadeas's murder, Adolin trying to nervously cover up that murder, and Dalinar beginning his coalition to unite the people of Alethkar. We have a frenetic part 3 in the middle of the book with our Band of Radiance attempted defense of the city of Kholinar, which ultimately ends in the tragic death of Elhokar by the hands of our interesting traitor in Moash. And we have the previously spoken of Sanderlanche in the concluding Part 5, where everyone comes together in this big battle to defend Thalen's city. However, the connective tissue that binds these 3 distinct acts, i.e. Parts 2 and 4, slow the story for expositional purposes, and it doesn't always work. Now, the exposition in Part 2 is great, as it serves the purpose of explaining Rashar's historical lore and adding context to the Fused, Odium, and even the Heralds. But the added exposition in Part 4, not so much. Following the climactic battle in Kholinar, our heroes are scammed into using a corrupted Oathgate which transports them to Shadesmar, and their time in Shadesmar is not quite as relevant. Now, maybe Sanderson further delves into the importance of culture and way of life for people living on Shadesmar in a future book, but as far as this book goes, Shadesmar holds little importance besides being a narrative tool to separate our heroes from Dalinar. Kaladin, Shallan, Adolin, Azure, and their respective Spren do nothing more than wander through this cognitive realm as they attempt to reach cultivation's perpendicularity, and the book very quickly becomes an extended travel adventure. Now, there's nothing wrong with a travel voyage in the middle of a fantasy epic, journey before destination and all that, but I question Sanderson's placement of this particular voyage just right before the book's climax. We bounce back and forth between Dalinar's real-life stakes of him trying to unite a divided world in the face of it being revealed that humans are in fact the original Voidbringers, to our group of Radiants just sailing around Shadesmar. I mean, don't get me wrong, the sailing does serve a purpose in trying to get our characters from point A to point B, but man, is there a jarring disconnect between the speed of both of these stories. I think Sanderson would have been better suited to cutting out all the stuff about Shadesmar's markets and towns, perhaps saving that for Rhythm of War, and adding more urgency to our group's quest in order to hurry them along to their perpendicularity destination. Not only would it make the Shadesmar story arc more engaging, but it would also lessen the disruption impact of going from an urgent do-or-die story to a not-so-urgent feeling travelogue. But okay, our heroes eventually overcome their trials on Shadesmar. What then? Well, the Sanderlanche silly, that's what's then. I'm not going to bother to summarize everything that transpires during this very cathartic conclusion, but suffice to say, Odium manifests himself outside of Thaylen City and engulfs Amaram's army in the thrill. This in turn causes Amaram's deepest desires to be unlocked, so he turns against Dalinar's forces and faces off against the recently freed from Shadesmar Kaladin in a one-on-one shonen battle while the rest of our crew sees to the city's defenses. It's beautifully poetic and how events sort of come full circle in this encounter, as Amaram is essentially responsible for Kaladin's lowest lows. It's a fantastically written battle which is given even greater gravitas thanks to the personal stakes involved.
"You're outclassed, spearman," Amaram said. "Given and convince the city to surrender. That is for the best. No more need die today. Let me be merciful."
Like you were merciful to my friends? Like you were merciful to me when you gave me these brands?
I left you alive. I spared you.
An attempt to assuage your conscience, Kaladin clashed with the High Prince. A failed attempt.
I made you, Kaladin.
Amaram's red eyes lit the crystals that rimmed his face.
I gave you that granite will, that warrior's pose. This, the person you've become, was my gift.
A gift at the expense of everyone I loved.
What do you care? It made you strong. Your men died in the name of battle so that the strongest man would have the weapon. Anyone would have done what I did, even Dalinar himself.
This battle also addresses one of my key complaints in Words of Radiance, where it seemed that Sanderson was always delving into the same Deus Ex Kaladin well, in order to have Kaladin always bail out the characters just in the nick of time in each of the previous books' climax. Not this time though. Cal's one-on-one battle with Amaram keeps him more than busy, so other characters have to rely on their own strengths in order to get them through their own respective dilemmas. And in fact, it's Kaladin himself who gets saved here at the conclusion of this battle, as it's his Bridgefor brother and Rock who comes in with the clutch last-minute killing blow through Amaram's rotting gemstone carcass. Now, admittedly, it did catch me off guard seeing Amaram bite the big one in only the third book, as I thought Sanderson was saving his confrontation with Kaladin to a later book in the story, but I suppose there's bigger fish to fry here in this series, as we have yet to see the full potential of Moash, Odium, or the ever-scheming Taravangian who appears to have officially teamed up with Odium in their quest to reshape the world. Nevertheless, although I personally enjoyed a lot of this book's conclusions, not everything Sanderson wraps up feels like it was tied with a neat bow. I do like Shallan and Adolin officially tying the knot and getting married, as I feel it's a nice subversion of expectations from the Kaladin/Shallan ship many readers were likely preparing for. But I don't like how undercooked Adolin's ultimate resolution is with regards to his homicide being revealed. Rather than being found out, Adolin straight up confesses to his horrible act at the conclusion of Words of Radiance, and everyone's reaction to his confession is disappointingly subdued. This is extremely lackluster, especially considering how much foreshadowing and build-up there was to this moment. Occasionally throughout this story, other characters will think about how Adolin is a great person and how he's such a great friend, with the expectation that it's all building up to this big reveal where Adolin will be found out and he'll have to face the consequences for what he's done. But no, that moment never comes. I mean, yes, Shallan does eventually find out, but only because Adolin tells her. He even admits to not feeling sorry for what he's done, and her reaction is underwhelmingly muted.
It was me. I'm the one the Spren copied the first time. I kept thinking about how I was lying to you, to Father, and to everyone. The Honorable Adolin Kholin, the consummate duelist, a murderer. And Shallan, I don't think I'm sorry. Sadeas was a monster. He repeatedly tried to get us killed. His betrayal caused the deaths of many of my friends. When I formally challenged him to a duel, he wiggled out of it. He was smarter than me, smarter than Father. He'd have won eventually. So I killed him. He pulled her to him and took a deep breath. Shallan shivered, then whispered, "Good for you."
Later on in the story, Adolin also confesses to Dalinar, and although Dalinar's perturbed reaction is more appropriate, he ultimately does nothing and even maintains Adolin's right to inherit the throne. What? No. Oh, it doesn't matter that Sadeas was a terrible person. Adolin committed a murder and needs to be held accountable for his actions. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like Adolin, and I know none of these characters are exactly saints, but they all should be held to a higher standard, especially given the status of them all being on Team Radiant. I don't know, maybe Navani or Jasna will discover Adolin's secret in Rhythm of War and they'll hold him to a higher scrutiny then, but in the meantime, the reveal here was a big, frustrating non-event. As far as his wife-to-be goes, Shallan isn't out of the woods either when it comes to my quibbles with this book. Now, I like Shallan's character, but besides occasionally deflating a scene's tension with some very mistimed jokes, I just don't find her journey in overcoming her Veil, Radiant, Shallan multiple personality crisis to be all that interesting. Yes, it's cool that Shallan has found a way to use her light-weaving powers to create multiple fake imitations of herself and others, but the root cause of her multiple personality disorder ultimately boils down to another case of Shallan struggling with her internal anxieties. Now, I'm not trying to disparage people with real-life anxieties, as mental health is a serious thing, but it's been 3 consecutive books of the same old song and dance with her character. I know we've still got 7 books left, but I would have figured that by this point in the story, Shallan would have already overcome her mental blockages and moved forward in her growth as a Knights Radiant. Instead, she's just consistently complaining and wallowing in the same old, and it's just not a fun read. But that aside, I pretty much loved every other character/story arc in this book. I personally would have liked to have seen a bigger reaction from the Radiance with regards to Seth Sun Villano's return, but his Skybreaker redemption arc was fascinatingly personal and definitely helped lift up some of the slower parts in the later sections of this book. The Warbreaker connections throughout this book are also very interesting. Seriously, if you haven't read that book already, go and read it. And I'm curious to see how the lore of that world connects to this one. Taravangian, that slimy man who's been cooking up something for the past 3 books, I'm excited to see what he turns into in the follow-up story now that he's teamed up with Odium. And Moash, whose personal vendetta against Elhokar has been fulfilled, leaves him open without a clear goal, so now that he's chosen to double down on his decision to back Team Fused, I'll be curious to see what twists and turns his story takes in the next book, especially with regards to his previous friendship with Kaladin himself. There's interesting stuff abound, so regardless of some disagreements I have with Sanderson's storytelling and Oathbringer, I am still in love with this world. And after I recover from some Stormlight fatigue, I'm tantalized to see how this story continues in the follow-up book, Rhythm of War. So all in all, despite my complaints regarding this book's length, which is compounded by some pacing issues and quibbles with some of the story's more disappointing resolutions, I still really liked Oathbringer. Exciting set pieces, including one of the best climaxes I've ever read in fantasy, lift a rather scattered narrative to being a very memorable experience. And although I'm not a 100% fan of every single character arc, I still really do like the characters and I'm curious to see where they go from here in the follow-up books. Now, ordinarily, this is the part where I would say that my next video will be a review covering Dawnshard, the follow-up novella which takes place between this book and the next Stormlight Cinderblock. However, in case you couldn't already tell, I'm kind of burned out on the Cosmere universe at the moment. I do enjoy this universe, but I need to take a break and read something else in the meantime. I want to do right by Sanderson, right by you guys, and the best way to do that is by going into the next set of Stormlight books as refreshed as possible. So if you're a Stormlight fan, hang tight for just a little while as we'll come back to this series again in the near future. However, if you're a book fan in general, I hope you'll stay tuned to my next video where we'll be taking a look at a new book. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys next time. The Advocate, out.